Good morning, Christ Church. Great to have you here. We're thrilled to have Professor Griffith Mann with us as our second of our four-part series on Notre Dame de Paris. This morning we welcome C. Griffith Mann, the Michel David Weil curator in charge of medieval art at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. He's going to speak to us about the shock of loss and the awe of resurrection that surrounds the story of Notre Dame de Paris. Its renewal speaks of the enduring power of Christianity. Griff oversees the medieval collections and curatorial teams at both the Met Fifth Avenue and the Met Cloisters. A specialist in late medieval Italy, he has written extensively on art, patronage, and devotion in Tuscany, and curated major exhibitions. Before joining the Met in 2013, he held senior curatorial positions at the Cleveland Museum of Art and the Walters Art Museum. Griff received his BA in art history and history from Williams College and his PhD in medieval art from Johns Hopkins University. Please join me in welcoming Professor Griff Mann to Christ Church.
Going to do a quick sound check. How is it in the back for everyone? Can everyone hear me okay? Perfect. Thank you so much. It is a pleasure to be here with you all at Christ Church, and I really very much appreciate the warm welcome and the introduction. I am also a graduate of Greenwich High School, so it's nice to be back in Greenwich. So the talk I'm going to give you will offer an overview of some of the work, the amazing work, that has transformed and restored the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris. Some of the pictures that you'll see are pictures that I took on a recent trip because I was just in Paris last week and had a chance to walk through the cathedral. Any of you who have been there recently, knowing the devastation that happened in April of 2019 when the fire broke out, will be absolutely amazed to see the cathedral back in the way that it is. It's thanks to a tremendous amount of support from around the world. I think that they raised around 800 million euro for this project, but also, as you'll learn, thanks to the work of many, many different kinds of specialists, teams of people from craftsmen and women to scientists who were responsible for the renovations that you'll be seeing. But I'd like to take you back at the beginning of the talk to that moment in April of 2019, when, to the horror of people across the city of Paris, and indeed people across the world, they realized that this icon, the soul of the French people, this Grande Dame, Notre Dame, was on fire. The world watched as the cathedral burned and flames fueled by the ribbed roof made hundreds of oak beams, some dating from the 13th century. The fire roared into the sky. While you might easily imagine that the quote that opens the title of my talk could have been shouted by thousands of Parisians and others who gathered in shock to realize that the cathedral was burning, it actually comes from a 12th century chronicler, a man named Gervase of Canterbury, who described the fire in his own cathedral in 1174. These are his words. Thus, the raging wind, finding a free entrance, increased the fury of the fire, and the flames beginning to show themselves, a cry arose in the churchyard. See, see, the church is on fire. So for us, from the vantage point of the 21st century, a cathedral fire might seem like a rare event. But actually, it was a very common event in the Middle Ages. And I want you all to think about that because fire, in many ways, is a devastating event. But in other ways, it leads to renewal and rebirth, just as Merrick was saying at the beginning during the introduction. So it's really that story of destruction and what happens in the wake of that kind of destruction that I'll be talking about today. And I want you to get in the mindset not of someone looking at the 21st century in shock and horror that the cathedral would be burning, but rather that this was a very typical and common event that transformed the way in which buildings were built over the course of the Middle Ages, the responses to the fire, and the things that happened in the wake of those devastating events for communities were galvanizing events for many places that led to tremendous innovations in Gothic art and architecture. So the fire is kind of a double-edged sword in this case. One thing I would like to do just to put that into context is just to mention that, as I've already said, fire was a constant threat in medieval buildings. This was especially true when most of the ceilings of medieval churches, think of the great Roman basilicas, were made out of wood. So in Gothic buildings, you have masonry vaults, and above those you have the wooden attics, and it's the wooden attic that burned in Notre Dame. But these buildings were very susceptible to fire, especially before the advent of Gothic architecture, when the masonry vaults really began in earnest. I show you here 3 images of cathedrals presently in France: Chartres, Reims, and Beauvais. Chartres Cathedral burned for the first time in 1020, and again in 1194. In the city of Reims, the cathedral was badly damaged in a fire in 1210, and at Beauvais, the cathedral was rebuilt after a fire in the 1180s. So this is something that you want to see as a constant part of the medieval landscape. And I'll give you 2 brief examples of buildings that have been transformed by fire. One is in England, and appropriately enough, given where we are today, it's Canterbury Cathedral. A fire broke out at Canterbury Cathedral on September 5th, 1174. And that's the chronicler's voice that you heard, a person who was living at the time, experienced the fire, and then went on to chronicle the rebuilding of the cathedral, taking people, his readers, through its transformation over a number of years. The fire was so bad that the roof melted, the leaden roof. There's actually fragments of the melted lead from this late 12th century fire still in Canterbury. And Gervase of Canterbury describes this event in the following way. In this manner, the house of God, hitherto delightful as a paradise of pleasures, was now made a despicable heap of ashes, reduced to a dreary wilderness, and laid open to all the injuries of weather. One could read that same kind of quote and imagine the devastation and that next day in Paris as people really came to terms with what had happened. The collapse of the flesh, the destruction of 3 vaulted sections of the nave, and the crossing. And what followed, however, in Canterbury was the reconstruction of the cathedral. There was a competition, and one of the builders who won that competition, who worked with the monks on the recreation of the building, the renovations, was a man who came from France. His name was William of Sens. So he brought this new building technology, which was just beginning to emerge in France at the time, to England. And in the wake of Canterbury's rebirth, here you'll see some of the work that he did to create this new masonry choir around the place of Thomas of Becket's martyrdom. The fire was in 1174, and the rebuilding of the choir here in Canterbury led to one of the most sensational building projects that England had seen up until then. And it led to a host of other developments across the country. Chartres is another case in point. And Chartres Cathedral, the fire here, although it had fires in the Middle Ages, the fire that I'm going to highlight actually happened in the early 19th century. Chartres itself is a little bit older rather than Notre Dame. The construction on the cathedral, as you now see it, began in 1194. It was largely complete by 1220. But on the evening of June 4th, 1836, sparks sprang from a stove that plumbers who had been up in the attic were using. And the whole building, the whole roof rather, lit on fire. So obviously this is an age before photography. So the only real image that we have is this painting of the cathedral on fire. You can see how devastating it was, particularly to the roof. So at that moment, there were decisions to be made because technology was very different than it was in the Middle Ages. You had the advent of new ways of approaching the reconstruction of the cathedral. So just as in the wake of the fire in Notre Dame in Paris, there were questions about how the work would be done. Would it be restored to its original state, or would there be some sort of contemporary statement? The same kinds of questions started in Chartres. But the decision was made in Chartres to reframe the roof with copper on the outside rather than lead. And I had the privilege in 2014 of making a trip to Chartres with colleagues who took me up into the attic. One of the things that I was not surprised for, that I was totally unprepared for, is the shock that I felt when I entered the attic space. Because in most cathedrals that were created in this time period, you've all probably heard about the Forest, right? That great attic level in Chartres that was filled with wooden timbers and beams. In Chartres, they made the decision not to redo that, but rather to use a new building technology, to use cast iron and steel. Up until the creation of the Eiffel Tower, several decades later, this was the largest steel structure in France. What you're looking at is, if you can imagine, we're standing with the west facade just behind us, looking down the length of the nave, and you can just see an area where you've got the crossing. So this whole space is open up. It was very controversial at the time. Victor Hugo, who was alive at the moment these debates were happening, just one moment, I'm going to get to said that we will make an iron roof, a sad expedient, which, fortunately at least, will not be visible. So Victor Hugo was not a fan of this, but the idea was that this would actually protect the cathedral from fires in the future. So this is one of the few cathedrals in France on this scale that employs this kind of roofing structure. But let's come back to Notre Dame. So you've got these examples of fires in the Middle Ages that are transforming the way in which buildings are created, as is the case in Canterbury. You have the work that was done in the 19th century in Chartres, which takes a very different approach. And these are the same questions that were posed immediately in the aftermath of the fire about how to rebuild Notre Dame. Here's a view of Notre Dame before the fire. One thing I should have done is shown you an image literally days before the fire, because you might recall that there was scaffolding around the flesh, the spire. So there was renovation work happening on site already. And so one of the first tasks that they had to confront in the wake of the fire is what to do with all that melted, now no longer structural load-bearing scaffolding. But in the immediate aftermath of the fire, President Macron put out a call for architectural proposals. And I'm showing you here one by one of the many architectural firms that proposed new designs for the cathedral. This was extremely controversial, and Macron backed off very quickly, and the decision was made to restore the cathedral to its original form, to use the building technologies that would have been used by the builders who started this work in the late 12th and into the 13th centuries. What I'd like to give you a sense of is what it feels like to be up in the attic. And I can't do that at Notre Dame because I've never myself been up there. But I did have the opportunity on this same trip that I referred to when I visited Chartres to go up in the attic of a nearby cathedral in Laon in France, slightly later than Notre Dame. But one of the things that was amazing about being up in this space is that you get up there by going into the towers, up one of those round staircases, ascending your way up to that level where the roof meets the body of the building itself. So you're right at the juncture between the masonry and the roof with the leaded exterior, and you can see those doors in the side of the roof. That's how you actually enter in to the attic level. Going inside the attic feels like you're in an upside-down ship. It's no wonder that they call it the nave, right? This is based on the Latin word for ship. And you can see all those all the joinery, all of these incredibly old, primarily oak, wooden timber that's used to create the structure, and then that walkway that takes you down just above the vaults. So what you're seeing down there below the walkway is the masonry of the ceiling, the vaulted ceiling of the cathedral. There's just a few details of some of the joinery, give you a quick sense of what it feels like to look across and then to look up above you, to get that sense of what the space feels like. And then coming back out to another section of the building, You're really up at the highest level of the cathedral looking out around the city. This is what that attic level in Notre Dame looked like before the fire. So note all of the timber that was felled centuries ago, nicely seasoned, ready for ignition. And below that, you have the masonry vaults themselves. You can just see their undulating shapes as you look down the nave towards the crossing. This is what burned. So when the fire started, it didn't take very long for it to, really wreak havoc on the roof. And here are some views of the immediate aftermath. So you can see the charred remains of the roof and then sections of the vaults that collapsed as the weight of the burning wood fell through the vaults of the cathedral. All of that scaffolding that you see that's melted in the middle is the scaffolding that was erected around the base of the spire directly above the crossing of the cathedral. So one of the first orders of business was to evaluate the scaffolding and to secure the site so that no further damage could happen. Amazingly enough, it was largely the masonry vaults that preserved so much of what's inside the cathedral down below, the stained glass, the sculpture. Obviously, there were tremendous challenges in the immediate aftermath of the fire. One, that it was essentially a site that was now permeated with lead dust, lead powder, all of the carnage and the destruction of the fire itself, and then these huge sections of scaffolding that had been melted and welded together. So one of the first things that was done is just to do what could be done to shore up the site, to add things like netting to prevent any further things from dropping down. But the cathedral was also open to the elements. So here you're seeing the crossing and then one of the other bays of the nave where there was tremendous devastation, where the masonry vaults themselves collapsed onto the cathedral floor. So in this diagram, one of the things that's helpful is that it takes you through the various stages involved in just securing the site. Getting all of that scaffolding out of the way, bringing new scaffolding in, and making it into a work site. A work site that would not only support the work of the rebuilding, but also support the investigations that would happen. The cathedral is now probably one of the best documented medieval buildings we have because of the teams of people that came together to study its construction, not just in the aftermath of the fire, but actually centuries of scholarship leading up to that moment. There were two scholars in particular whose work was vital. One is a scholar who was based at Vassar, whose name was Andrew Tallon. And Andrew Tallon, in the, second decade of the early 2000s, had done laser scanning of the whole building. So there was a kind of digital fingerprint, if you will, of the architecture of Chartres. There was also a team of French architects who had worked in the attic, and they had hand-drawn, mapped out all of the building elements, all the individual timbers that were used to create the attic. So they had these baselines that were tremendously helpful in allowing these teams of architects and historians and scientists to approach the work. But the engineering was really the first challenge. So you have the need to rebuild the scaffolding, to remove all the old scaffolding, bring the new scaffolding in, and then to shore up the masonry, because people weren't sure about whether the masonry was damaged by the heat of the fire. Not to mention the fact that the masonry was also open to the elements for so long. So when you get water leaching into porous limestone, that water can create salts that then begin pushing away the stone, making it less strong than it used to be. So one of the first steps, in addition to the scaffolding, was getting wooden elements in to buttress the vaults that still survived, as well as the external buttresses. But imagine the specialists that you need to do this kind of work. People who are trained in working at altitude with ropes. And here you can see sections of the damaged original scaffolding and then the superstructure that's being built to do the work. This amazing view up through the crossing. This is where the spire dropped down through the vaults. So we're looking from the high altar, essentially, at Chartres, all the way up through the crossing in this view. You had people who were lowered down on ropes to investigate the masonry, of the open elements, these areas that have been exposed to water. And then eventually the work of rebuilding the scaffolding inside the structure of of Notre Dame. So you see this view is actually from the nave towards the crossing, but imagine this forest of scaffolding that allowed workers to get up and work on the higher elevations of the building, to check the masonry, to look at the stained glass, and eventually constructing the scaffolding around the rebuilt flesh, the spire. Just a few shots to give you some sense of those initial stages, right? So you've got the scaffolding inside the nave that allows people to better access the upper elevations of the building. What they're doing here is putting in these bespoke supports so that you have wooden elements that are holding up the vaults in the event that the vaults themselves are insecure. They do this also on the exterior of the building. So all of these flying buttresses, these elements of the building that are added on the outside to help control the weight of the roof from pushing out the walls, right? This is one of the major innovations of Gothic architecture, allowing these windows to be opened up to stained glass, because so much of the load-bearing work, the engineering work of the building, is being done on the outside. They're craning in these elements. Think of them as custom fitted for each individual buttress so that you shore up that site. So I think this photograph, the fire's in April, this photograph is from about July, so the work happened very quickly. You can already see that they have temporary enclosures over the sanctuary behind the crossing, as well as the nave. They're still developing what will happen around the crossing itself, but this is one of the major stories of the recreation of the building, is the decision not to go with a contemporary solution, but rather to go with a medieval solution. The thing is that in the Middle Ages, you had so many more first-growth forests than we do now. So how do you get these huge pieces of timber, around 1,200 mature trees, from first-growth forests? People across France, private citizens who had private property, as well as the state, provided areas where the woodworkers could go out and source these tall trees. The work had to happen very quickly. It started in March of 2020. 1,000 oak trees were cut from roughly 200 forests across France to make frames for Notre Dame Cathedral's roof and for the spire. The trees were very carefully selected in January and February of 2020. They had to fit very precise requirements defined by the chief architects in charge of the building's restoration. The one thing I'd mention here is that most of the trees that were selected were between 150 and 200 years old. They chose to harvest them in the winter because they didn't want the sap to be as active in the trees. That was an important part of the seasoning decision that they made. And they were working on a very tight timeline. So here, I actually attended a talk in New York that was given 3 years ago, and the people who were speaking at the talk about the renovations then underway at Notre Dame, it hadn't opened yet, had a scale model of the attic. So here you're seeing a view through cross-section, and you get some sense of the carpentry as it's been imitated in this model. But we're talking about a tremendous amount of wood, carefully selected, most of it machine sawn, but then hand-finished. So that's the other challenge, is that the people that do this work aren't, it's not like this is a living, breathing industry anymore. So you had an international group of carpenters that were brought together to do the work of rebuilding the attic. And they set up a workshop not far outside of Paris, close to the River Seine, where they actually built the attic. Not on the site of the cathedral, but to the specifications that they were using with all the information that had been gathered. There were 3 barges eventually once the attic was disassembled and brought on site. So here you're seeing an image of the delivery of the frames for the attic. Then you have to crane them up onto the building site and then put each one individually into place, and there you get a sense of the work in process. So this is one of the most amazing stories of the cathedral, and it was based on a lot of earlier work as well as research that was done in the wake of the fire. So if gives you a sense of what's happening in that area where the fire broke out, the rest of the talk I'd like to focus on is on some of the discoveries that happened lower down in the building as a result of parts of the building being visible for the first time since the cathedral had been created. So I'll take you back to this image, right? This captures the moment when the flesh is collapsing. It drops down through the crossing. And in the wake of the fire, that's what the view looked like. But now you have all these elements of the building that are exposed so that researchers can get in and see parts of the building that would have been visible to their builders, but not visible to those people who came along after. But there was tremendous devastation inside the building itself. The masonry vaults, the carnage of the fire itself, all of that old medieval wood dropped down onto the floor of the cathedral. It was, as I said earlier, a toxic site. So you had to go in hazmat suits. So a lot of the building work that was happening during these early stages, the first few years of reconstruction, the site was very carefully controlled. People who went in there went through a room where they washed themselves. They went through the reverse process going out. It was very difficult to access. But here you can see the damage in the crossing. And it's this crossing that was the site of some of the most interesting discoveries. But one of the first tasks was obviously to get all the rubble out. But you also don't want to be throwing out everything because you don't want to throw out parts of the building that might be valuable to the lessons that can be gleaned. So early on, the real focus was on consolidating the work site. They created a structure above the church that they referred to as the umbrella. This was a movable roof. Think about our contemporary sports stadiums, right, where some of them have movable roofs. This was the idea here, is to be able to protect the building from the elements, keep it open as a work site, and allow the researchers to get in. This just gives you a graphic of the different kinds of people involved in the work. You have, obviously, art historians, architectural historians, but also scientists, geologists, people who specialize in stained glass, craftspeople. We're talking about huge numbers of people who are coming together as teams and sharing knowledge. Here you can get a sense of what it might have been like to be in the work site in the days when it was still contaminated, hazmat suits essentially, but they're sorting through all the rubble, categorizing it, scanning it, giving it inventory numbers, and putting things in a large storage area. You also had people all across the building beginning to do the investigatory work. Stained glass specialists evaluating the stained glass, masonry specialists looking at the walls, the vaults, looking across the building for mason's marks, things like that. And one of the most fascinating discoveries came out of the work that took place during this stage of the reconstruction. Notre Dame, as it turns out, is one of the first Gothic cathedrals to introduce iron in addition to masonry. So think about the primary building materials as being stone and wood. One of the real innovations of Gothic architecture is the introduction of iron staples that will bond together the masonry blocks to increase their strength so that you can build thinner and taller. And it wasn't known that Notre Dame was the first Gothic building to use this technology until the fire, because these areas were concealed by the roof. So here you can see the staples joining together blocks, right? So the idea is to allow these blocks to resist the force of the roof that's pushing down on the outer wall of the building. And I'm going to back up just to give you a sense here. What I'm talking about is this area right here. So they've got shoring up of the wall of the cathedral by basically stapling them together with iron. They did carbon date tests on the iron, which demonstrated definitively that this is medieval iron from the time of the building. So that was one of the real discoveries to come out. There are Gothic buildings that were created later that used the same technology, but it appears that it was first introduced in Notre Dame, Paris. The other thing that's amazing to think about is the work that had to happen in the crossing. So you're seeing a view now down through the scaffolding to the crossing of the church. Imagine that the vaults are still open directly above. And the reason that they began excavating here is because they had to scaffold the whole thing so that they could recreate the masonry vault above the crossing. So before that central core scaffolding was created, which had an elevator that would take workers up to the top part of the building itself, they wanted to do some excavations. This was a time-limited excavation because it was going to be covered up. But they discovered a number of very interesting things. One is some burials. Not unusual in a Gothic cathedral to find burials, especially near the high altar. That was a place reserved for some of the most prestigious members of society. But one of the things that was interesting in their discoveries is this human-shaped lead coffin. There was a lot of debate about the identity of the figures inside, and they discovered that one of them was a prelate of Notre Dame who died in 1710. That was relatively easy to figure out because there was actually an inscription on his coffin. But these were covered over by the floor of the cathedral. There was no sense that they didn't really know what they might find. But as an art historian, one of the most amazing discoveries was about 1,200 fragments of medieval sculpture dating from the 12th century, from about 13th century, about 1250. All of it preserving much of its polychromy, its painted decoration. This sculpture appears to be connected to the rood screen, the jubé, as it's called in French, which would have been a wall separating the sanctuary from the nave. In many Gothic cathedrals, in fact, in all Gothic cathedrals, you would have had these structures until the 18th century. As the liturgy changed, these jubés were all dismantled. And this jubé that was created around 1250, they basically took down the jubé. The sculptural fragments were buried to create rubble for the new construction that went on above it. But here you can get some sense of the sculptures from the 13th century that are emerging for the first time as a result of these excavations. When I talk about polychromy, it's very rare to find medieval sculpture that still preserves its painted decoration. Some of you might have seen an exhibition at the Met a few years ago called Chroma, which was about colored decoration in the ancient world. We're also accustomed to seeing marble plain sculptures where that beautiful marble is so kind of, such a beautiful surface. But in the ancient world, that marble also would have been painted, and the same was true in the medieval world. These limestone sculptures were that much more animated because of their colored decoration. And here you can see the vivid blue of the, perhaps it's an apostle. This is a disembodied head, so we don't necessarily know the figure that it belonged to. Also, large architectural elements. This is a carved canopy that would have been part of a figural ensemble. All of these objects were cataloged, and they were stored off-site in the cathedral. But this unfolded just as the French museum, the Musée Cluny, which is a museum in Paris dedicated to the art and architecture of the Middle Ages, sort of a sister institution to the cloisters here in New York. They were actually planning an exhibition to coincide with the reopening of the cathedral. These discoveries were made during the planning of the show, and they were able to incorporate about half a dozen to a dozen sculptures from the jubé into the show. This is one of the most amazing discoveries in medieval sculpture, certainly during my lifetime. Here you get a sense of how all of that material is organized and cataloged, but they wanted to clean it for the show. And I just wanted to give you a sense of where this is in the cathedral. So that light blue area is the crossing. That red line is where the jubé, the rood screen, would have been. So that's the section that would have been a figured sculpture decoration creating essentially a barrier between the sanctuary and the nave. But it was a barrier that functioned more like a bridge because it actually had an area up on top where the Gospels could be proclaimed to the congregation. But that was taken away. And so the way that you see Notre Dame now, this is a photograph on the left that I took last week. You're looking all the way down, so you have that clear view all the way down the nave into the sanctuary behind. There's only one cathedral in France, one major cathedral in France that still has its choir screen. And it's in southwestern France in a city called Albi, and I'm showing you an image of that on the right. So you get some sense of what a presence this would have been in the cathedral itself. Albi, if you ever have a chance to go, I highly recommend it. It's not far from Toulouse. What distinguishes this cathedral from its sisters in France is that it's created in brick. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Monument. It's one of the only French cathedrals created in brick rather than in limestone. So here you get a sense of the monumental architecture, and then a little bit more of a view of the choir screen, and then into the choir that provides, that is directly behind. So in my last few slides, I'm going to show you some images of the exhibition at the Musée Cluny. This took place in the spring of 2024. And what you're seeing are those elements that you saw photographs of a few moments ago that were embedded in the floor of the cathedral, now conserved and preserved so that they can be presented. There are still no plans for where this material will go ultimately. There is talk about opening a museum next to the cathedral in Notre Dame in a nearby building, and that's where some of this might ultimately reside. But this was a tremendous opportunity to see things that had freshly been excavated and restored for the exhibition itself. I'll give you some sense of the difference. So I showed you that photograph there of the canopy. That's the canopy installed in the exhibition. And then one of the heads with this remarkable polychromy. Now you can see all the burial accretions, all the dirt from the cathedral floor, or from the burial under the cathedral floor has been removed, and you have that wonderful image. And then this is actually probably the face of Christ. This might have been from the entombment of Christ. And then I have one little fragment, because it's interesting to see not just the painted decoration, but the fact that there was on some of these low-relief gilded decoration. So imagine seeing a whole figured ensemble in 3 dimensions, colored and gilded, serving as that threshold between the sanctuary and the nave. This is something that I was really excited to have an opportunity to see. This figure on the right is probably a figure of Aaron, the brother of Moses. So there were Old Testament subjects as well as New Testament subjects figured in the sculpture. And then just to give you a sense, these are drawings that were captured of the Notre Dame rood screen prior to it being dismantled. So you get that sense of the sanctuary beyond, but this wall of sculpture in front. And that's where these fragments came from. What was really interesting, to me at least, is that in the 1980s, scholars began to collect a group of leaves that were part of an illuminated manuscript that was painted in the 14th century. But it was posited that these manuscript leaves were actually taking their point of inspiration from the sculptures of the Jubei. This was a theory based on documents and on images like that drawing. But now we actually have sculptures that allow us to make these comparisons. Sculptures created around 1250 with manuscript illuminators who are looking at that Jubei and incorporating it into their paintings in the middle of the 14th century. This work that I'm showing you on the left is a work that's now in a private collection in Hong Kong. And there is a leaf in Chicago as well, acquired by the museum in 1922. And the reason I show this is because one of those sculptural fragments you can see in the image on the right is of a man dressed in a robe holding some kind of object. That's probably an image of Christ as he's on his way to Calvary, carrying the cross. And that object is the cross. And you can see on the upper left is that figure of the way to Calvary. Here, 3 torsos, very likely from the crucifixion. That image in the middle is the torso of Christ, and then you have the good thief and the bad thief flanking him to left and right, just as it is in the manuscript illumination at lower left. So what was a theory posited by scholars was actually confirmed by the sculptural excavations that took place. Now, if you go to Chartres, I keep saying Chartres. If you go to Notre Dame, this is a view that I took last week. It's very easy to get into the cathedral. There is a line. If you can get tickets that are reserved times, or you can just wait in the line. It tends to move along, so it's not a big deal. But they've removed all the scaffolding from the front of the facade, so it's no longer a work site in the way that it has been for so long. But I want to play you this video. The image on the right is a video, and pay attention to the upper window in the middle, because you'll see someone walk by, just like in Grand Central Station when you sometimes see people walking in the glass. That's because this remains a work site. So even as you're looking at this brilliantly preserved and restored interior, now so resplendent with stained glass, the cleaned walls, the new masonry vaults, the cathedral remains a place where work continues, and it probably will for some years. But as you, I'll give you this image one more time. So inside that upper window tracery, sorry, I have to do it this way maybe. You'll see someone pass by. Anyway, it's not playing for me, but that's all right. You get the picture. So the crossing now, this is what it looks like. So that gaping hole that we saw, I'll show you one detail with the capstone with this image of the Virgin and Child at the heart of Notre Dame once again. And I encourage all of you to go if you have the opportunity. This is the space where the excavations took place. So there's undoubtedly more there, but we'll never know what's under that floor outside of those trenches that they excavated. But the discoveries that they made are startling and are changing the way in which Gothic art and architecture is being written about. So I'll end with this image, which I took on the same trip, just to give you that sense of the cathedral on the front is open for business. The cathedral on the back, there's still a lot of work happening. You can see the trusses underneath the buttresses in the choir, for instance. Those wooden armatures are still there to support the masonry as they continue the work ahead. And then a final image, just a shout out to the international work that the international team that this work required. The group that I referred to as the people doing the carpentry, the core group was an organization called Carpenters Without Frontiers. Think of Doctors Without Borders. These are Carpenters Without Borders. But they are all trained specialists who know how to work in the old style. 3 of them pictured here were American, and I'm sure that there were more. The man on the left was from Boston. His name was Jackson Dubois. He helped to construct the spire. In the middle, upper right, is someone who was involved in reconstructing the nave. His name was Hank Silver. And down in the yellow helmet is Michael Burry from Boston, who helped to construct the spire. So it was an amazing response, an international response, not just in terms of donors, but in terms of expertise and know-how, craftsmanship, and scholarship that brought the cathedral back. So happy to field any questions, and I want to thank you all for your kind attention. Yes?
Griff, that was superb. So let's see. Let me get the mic to...
So wonderfully, the cathedral's been rebuilt in wood. How do we avoid it all going up in flames again?
It's a great question. So they have added 2 new things to the wooden attic. One is a misting system. So there is fire prevention measures that can be taken there. But the other thing that they've done is they've actually added 2 sections to the attic, which are essentially like firewalls. So although there could be a fire in a section of the attic, it won't be able to spread in the same way that it did in the wake of April of 2019.
You spoke about the molten lead and the impact of the rain on the sandstone.
Yes.
What has been the impact on the acoustics from the cleaning of the sandstone which I believe was done with an acid wash to get rid of the lead contamination.
Yes, great question. I'm going back here to one of my images because, let's see, do I have... yeah, you get some sense of the surface of the masonry that they were dealing with in the wake of the fire. Acoustics was a major concern. In fact, 2 years ago, there was an article in the New York Times about the restoration of Notre Dame Cathedral, just about the acoustics, because they did have acousticians in to work as one of the groups of teams that were involved with the cathedral renovations. So there was a tremendous amount of attention to the acoustics, and they wanted to ensure that the new space had the same acoustics as the old space, and I think that they've achieved that. Yes?
Hi, I was there last week too, but I noticed the rose windows still look magnificent, but on the lowest level, a lot of the stained glass looked like it had been replaced with a much newer style. Is that true?
I don't know that it was replaced as part of the renovations, but the stained glass in the cathedral overall is a mix of medieval and much later stained glass. They did discover that, I mean, so this isn't the first time that Notre Dame has been restored. The major moment was in the wake of Viollet-le-Duc's work on the cathedral, and he actually added a lot of 19th century stained glass in a medievalizing manner. But in the case of the rose, I believe that the roses were consolidated, and I'm not aware that new glass was added, but they made very careful studies of the rose windows.
So, Griff, I had the good fortune to stay in an apartment that belongs to a parishioner and rent that for 2 weeks, 8 minutes away from the cathedral, and went over about 6 or 7 or 8 times while I was in Paris in late May and June. I was amazed with what they've done, but I did notice that the chapels seem to be rather barren and very brightly illuminated with some new works of art, such as made of macrame or contemporary art pieces. How much was destroyed in terms of 17th, 18th century paintings and furnishings and other things? Because it's got the sense of being completely cleared out almost down below.
I don't actually have a sense of how much was destroyed. I think a tremendous amount was saved, and much of that was conserved. And it might be that in some of those subsidiary chapels, there's still conservation work that's taking place, and that might be a temporary look, but I'm not really sure.
Other questions?
Is there any push to further excavate the floor to obtain more information?
There is not. There was a push during the project to have a longer window to do the excavations. But because of the timeline that the French were working under, there is actually a French archaeological group that's called in anytime there's construction where they encounter historic remains. It's they're called INRAP, and INRAP was given a very time-limited window. So as you can see, the excavation images I shared, which are here, the area that they were allowed to excavate was really limited to the crossing where they had to build the scaffolding, and the reason for that is that they actually had to put foundations in the floor to allow for the weight of the scaffolding to be built on top of it. So I can't imagine that you'd have excavations taking place inside the cathedral precinct, especially, I'm just going to give you a contemporary view of that section of the building there. So it's hard to imagine that they're going to allow areas of that now complete flooring to be lifted up and done again. So I think in terms of the lessons that have been gleaned from this section of the building, that's probably it.
What about the spire? I guess that from your photos, I didn't see it there. Right?
The spire is back up, yeah, and it was actually recreated.
Is it the same material and stuff?
Same material, wood with a lead facing. Lots of craftsmen involved in the creation of that work, and the spire as an architectural structure is new, but the large sculptural figures that are around the base of the spire had actually been removed for conservation when the fire broke out. So there are some elements that are part of that 19th century spire that still survive.
Thank you, Griff, for a phenomenal presentation.
You're welcome.
The question I have is, what work is underway for all the forests and all the other Gothic cathedrals that I guess I read an article a couple of years ago of there's a real danger.
There is. I mean, one of the things that was highlighted with this work is there was such an outpouring of support for the restoration of the cathedral that this project was incredibly well funded. But the reality is that the funds required to sustain and maintain these great buildings is limited. And there is work underway now at Saint-Denis, in many ways the birthplace of Gothic architecture, to recreate one of the towers there. And I think that the reason that they're able to do that is because of the galvanizing support that was received for Notre Dame. The state actually now has funds that can be dispersed selectively to support conservation and restoration work in other cathedrals, but that's going to be an issue for generations, is to how these buildings can be sustained over their long lifetimes. Yeah.
Hi, I understand that the Americans were the second largest
That's right,
group
donor
to
base.
donate
Yeah.
to Notre Dame. Do you have an idea of how many Americans actually worked on the cathedral?
I don't know the number, but I'm sure that it's out there. I would actually recommend the American Friends of Notre Dame. They have a great website that has a tremendous amount of information, as well as Notre Dame's own website, and that you might be able to have some of those statistics would be there. But there was, at least on the carpentry side, I know that there was, obviously I highlighted 3. I have a colleague whose name is Jennifer Feltman, who is a scholar of medieval art and architecture, who is part of the scientific group. So there's really an international group of scholars. You know, obviously the majority are French-based, but she has a NEH-funded grant that is allowing for the study of some of the polychromy, not just of the things that are at Notre Dame and the works that were excavated, but also of some of the fragments from the cathedral that have since been dispersed into other collections, like those of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. We have elements of Notre Dame's original sculptural decoration that were removed from the cathedral in the wake of the French Revolution.
Could you just say a word about the destruction that took place during the French Revolution?
Yeah, I mean, it was transformative for the building, particularly for sculpture and figure decoration. So if you go to the facade of Chartres, let me see if I've got, sorry, I don't know why I've got Chartres in my head. Yeah, that right portal, which is the St. Anne portal, that is the standing figures on either side of the door are 19th century, because the figures that were there originally were taken down by the revolutionaries and systematically destroyed. Anything that had a crown was at risk. So the Gallery of Kings, those heads were dismantled. So you have to imagine that there was a tremendous amount of destruction, particularly focused on the decoration itself. And then the building, because it was secularized, became a warehouse. And so if you look at photographs taken, let's say, before Victor Hugo begins his writing, you see a very different dilapidated structure. And it was really Victor Hugo's work that galvanized the French interest in restoring the building, and that's when Viollet-le-Duc got his work started in the 19th century. But we have, the reason I pointed out the St. Anne portal is because the tympanum and lintel remain 13th century sculpture, but all of the standing figures on either side of the door are 19th century. The fragments of the original sculptures are preserved in the Musée Cluny in Paris, just across the other side of the river.
Well, I hope this has inspired everyone as we move towards the capital campaign and restoration of Christ Church. The wardens and I will be waiting for any of you who'd like to speak to us right after the service or the forum. But Griff, thank you. This has been just exceptional. So enlightening. God bless you. Thank you all. Have a great week ahead, everyone.